Welcome back to yet another REACHLaw webinar, this time on UK REACH and a very current topic on the Alternative Transitional Registration model and the consultation by Defra that has just been launched almost 2 weeks ago. So today it's only me having this webinar for you. So I'm Frederik Johanson. I'm a partner, head of sales at REACHLaw, have a long background in chemical regulations, and have been also, of course, working with UK REACH related topics from the beginning and even before that. So very nice to be here with you having this very current webinar as mentioned. So some practical information on the webinar, so you can send in questions using the chat function in the GoToWebinar system. We will also answer these questions, or at least try to answer those questions during the Q&A session at the end. Also try to answer questions that you've been submitting ahead of the webinar during the registration. When you were registering for this webinar, you were able to provide questions, so we'll try to tackle those also. And a recording of this webinar will be placed on our YouTube channel called REACHLaw Talks within a week or so. So if you missed this here today, no worries, you will find it on YouTube. And as before, please do feel free to send us feedback and improvement suggestions and so forth. Thank you. So the agenda is very packed, and I can tell you already that we will go over 60 minutes as per usual when it comes to our, or my, specifically my webinars. We'll start with a REACHLaw brief for those of you who do not know us yet. Then we'll look at, just to give you a quick overview of the UK REACH regulation as it currently stands, because it's been a while since we've had actually a webinar on UK REACH, because there's not been happening a lot, and everyone's been anticipating this alternative transitional registration model to be published. And that has now happened with the public consultation, which we will have a look at also in the agenda. And then we'll go into more details on this ATRm model, as it's also known, so the Alternative Transitional Registration Model, or ATRm. And then we'll look at some practical implications of the ATRm at the end before concluding, and then go into the Q&A. So as I said, be mentally prepared for plus 60 minutes of this webinar. And as I said, if you have to go by that time or at any point, of course, you will be able to look at this recording afterwards. So REACHLaw, so who are we? What's our focus? So we provide services for REACH and REACH-like chemical regulations globally. So this is now, of course, also UK REACH, which will be a topic of today, but EU REACH, Turkey, KKD, so Turkey REACH, in other words, K-REACH, which is our newest, let's say, entry into the family, a REACHLaw family, so to speak. So we have an office now also since last year in Seoul, in South Korea, providing services for K-REACH and K-OSHA there. But then also, of course, here in the head office in Helsinki, we support for EU REACH, and of course in Manchester for UK REACH and so forth. But we also have an office in New Delhi in India, servicing Indian clients and providing support for India specific regulations such as India BIS. India REACH is not there yet, so we will not support that until it's entering into force. So I guess you know this, I mean, you know this already, but we provide a full set of market access related services pertaining to chemical products that you are wanting to place on these different markets. So that entails the basic registration type of requirements, notifications, but also going into more, let's say, detailed or demanding work such as authorization, lead registration, and everything related, and also functioning as an outsourcing partner for companies who do not want to do certain tasks by themselves. They can outsource compliance tasks to REACHLaw to take care of, and so forth. In the interest of time, I'll just skip to UK specific. So in the UK, of course, we provide UK only representative services through our Manchester office, but also all the related notifications such as doings, deferred registrations, NRES, inquiries, lead registrations, authorizations, co-registrations according to this ATRm model, and currently according to the current legal text, and so forth. So a full set of services also, and more specifically for UK REACH. As mentioned, we do have our YouTube channel called REACHLaw Talks. You'll find this webinar there, and also our previous webinars and clips coming up and so forth. So head over there and please like and subscribe if you find it of interest. Also, if you are attending any of these events, such as ChemCon Asia next week in Bangkok, then you will be able to meet REACHLaw and myself there. We're happy to discuss, for example, what we're discussing here today in more detail, and also ChemSpec in Düsseldorf in a couple of weeks, and then also TurkChem later on in the year. But next week, ChemCon Asia in Bangkok, if you're there, come and say hello. We will have a stand actually there also. The usual disclaimers and copyrights. So the content in this presentation is for general information purposes only and is not substitute for consultation with professional experts in this area. So any actions you may take is on your responsibility, etc. In the safe interest of time, I'll just skip this. You can pause the video on YouTube to read this in detail if you like. Okay, so as per usual, I will just terminate the video for the live attendees so that we can focus on the presentation, and let's dive into the details, starting with UK REACH and the current status. So UK REACH, as we all know, it already entered into force beginning of 2021 and constitutes several assortment of defined statutory instruments as well as the original EU REACH legal text. Sorry, I had to cough there. And plus some implementing regulations and so forth. As we all know, it actually, even though it's called UK REACH, it only applies in Great Britain. So in England, Wales and Scotland. Northern Ireland is outside. So the main requirements under UK REACH is to register substances manufactured or imported into Great Britain at volume starting at 1 ton per year. So the no data, no market requirements apply. And then there are certain substances subject to authorization need to be authorized for specific uses. Then we have restrictions in Annex 17 that are subject to restrictions. Then you need to use chemicals, mixture substances according to provided safety data sheets, guidance on safe use, and also communicate certain information in the supply chain, for example, on substances of very high concern containing articles. So this is in a nutshell what UK REACH governs. So the same as EU REACH, no surprise there. So the focus today will be more on the registration part, as the name also implies on this webinar. So important consequences of UK REACH is that UK manufacturers, while they, GB located manufacturers are still manufactured according to UK REACH. GB-based importers who imported chemical substances from outside, from anywhere except the EU or the European Economic Area or Northern Ireland are still considered importers. But those of you who imported chemical substances from the EU Economic Area and Northern Ireland are now suddenly going from downstream users, you now suddenly become importers, and you need to comply with these, for example, registration requirements, which we are talking about today. So some definitions, and I'm going through this quite quickly, and we'll speed up slides go forward because this is just a recap. So just to mention that existing substances are all those substances that were EU REACH registered by anyone. Didn't need to be in the UK, but anywhere in the EU for EU REACH purposes by the time of exit, so by end of 2020. These are called transitional substances sometimes, and they are subject to these transitional provisions such as downstream user import notification, grandfathering, NRES, so new registration of existing substance, and so forth, and also subject to these extended registration deadlines. So today we will focus mostly on the existing substances because the ATRm, this model applies to these substances. There are some small exceptions, but we'll talk about those in the slides. New substances are all the other substances, and these will be require full registration before being placed on the GB market at 1 ton per year. An existing supply, albeit we will not cover this in detail, but good to know that these are substances that were imported to Great Britain between so in the year 2019 and 2020. So these substances can then be subject to downstream user import notification by the importer of these substances, and they can benefit from these transitional provisions. So that's very good to understand. And as I said, we will not go into details here. We have other webinars from the past where we dealt into these in detail. So quickly on the key transitional measures pertaining to registration. So we have the good old grandfathering case, meaning that you were a GB-based EU REACH registration holder at the time of exit, so by end of 2020. And this meant that you had your asset as an EU REACH registration, and that is now grandfathered into this UK REACH, provided you did this sort of grandfathering notification, albeit the deadline has passed. If you forgot to do that, please be in contact with the HSE. They will probably let you do it still. However, then we have these GB-based importers or only representatives that are importing these existing substances under existing supply, as we looked at previously. Those are eligible for this downstream user import notification, and you can still do that if you haven't done so. There was a deadline in October 2021, but it is still possible to notify. And all of these grandfathered and downstream user import notified substances will then be subject to these registration deadlines depending on the tonnage band, the hazards of the substance. We'll come back to that in just a few slides. If you do not, if you are not part of any of these, so you are not eligible for doing or grandfathering, then you have to, but you still have an existing substance, then you have to go through an inquiry and submit the so-called new registration of an existing substance, this NRES, and go through the first part, which is a deferred registration submission. We will not cover this in detail here. But basically, the substance registration requirements are the same as for EU currently. We'll talk about the ATRm model in just a few slides. So if you manufactured imported substances as such part of mixtures 1 ton or more annually, then you need to be registered unless they are specifically exempt. And the tonnage band, the higher the tonnage band, the higher the data requirements, and of course the HSE registration fees. You can essentially register as full substances or as intermediates. If you register as intermediates under strictly controlled conditions, then you are eligible for less data requirements. That's it in brief. And just wanted to show this. These are the current standard registration data requirements for UK REACH and EU REACH, the same. So meaning the higher the tonnage band of your registered substance, the higher the data requirements as per the different annexes of the regulations. So UK REACH also. And if you are registering over 10 tons of substances per year, then you also have to provide a chemical safety report. So we'll come back to this in the slides. So this is, as I said, just background information. But what we had last year, and also as a result of a separate consultation a couple of years back, was that the deadlines for these transitional substances were the transitional registration deadlines were postponed. So they used to be 23 and so forth, but now we have 26, 28, and 30, depending on the type of substance, the volume, annual volumes thereof, and whether it has been on the candidate list at certain times. I will not go into details here. You can feel free to pause the video in the, for example, in YouTube to have a look. But essentially, these are very similar to those for EU REACH back in the day, except of course the deadlines are different. And here we have the non-existing supply of existing substances, very tongue twister there, but it means that you have to first submit an inquiry and a deferred registration before you can place it on the market. You are still eligible for the transitional registration timelines for providing the full dossier, and you're still eligible for the ATRm model, as we will look briefly, not briefly, but in a few slides. And so that's good to know. However, for all other substances, meaning new substances, they have to be registered according to the full requirements before being placed on the market in Great Britain. And for UK REACH, also the joint submission concept applies. So you have a lead who submits bulk of the data for this particular substance, and then you have co-registrants, sometimes called member registrants, who join this joint submission and then register by these applicable registration deadlines. And this was also covered actually in the consultation, so that's why I'm just reminding you of this here. So without going into details here, you essentially have three ways of joining this joint submission. One is the grandfathered registrations way. We discussed it briefly. Then you have the do-in route, and then you have this NRES way. But the summa summarum here is that all of these feed into the same joint registration with these deferred registration deadlines for submitting the full registration dossier. As part of the NRES, you just in the beginning submit essentially a placeholder, and you pay the HSE fee, but later on you then buy time to join this joint registration effort later on. And this joint registration effort will now constitute the ATRm model, as to be discussed. So how this feeds into the system is that grandfathered registrations will become a member of the substance group. Do-in route substances will become member of the substance group, provided they submit an inquiry, but they can place the substances on market. Same with the grandfathered. For the NRES cases, you first have to submit an inquiry, become a member of the substance group, and then a deferred registration, which allows you to place on the market in Great Britain. After that, select lead registrants, and then you have co-registrants and lead registrants jointly working together to submit the joint submission to the HSE by the applicable registration deadlines. So as I said, if you want to go into these details, we have quite good webinars, albeit a few years old already, available on REACHLaw Talks that goes into more details of these. Also, just wanted to highlight the different fees we have for the registrations in UK for UK REACH, but be aware that these are highly likely now changing also with this ATRm model. This was not part of the current consultation, but these will be changing in the at some point as part of this when the ATRm model kicks in. I will talk about that, but I'll not talk about the fees, but good for you to know that they are looking to revamp these lower. My personal guesstimate, it's at least half will disappear from these fees, probably more, to be determined. And for those of you who are outside of Great Britain, you can, of course, as with any other REACH-like chemical regulation, you should kind of appoint an only representative if you are a manufacturer or a formulator residing outside of Great Britain. And this OR can then take care of all of these requirements so that you can place your chemical substances on the GB market, including doing registrations, ATRm model, we'll talk about that and so forth. And REACHLaw is an OR for UK REACH purposes, and as I said, we have our legal entity in the UK and the office in Manchester taking care of these type of businesses. And just to, as a final slide of the recap, is that the UK Health and Safety Executive is of course the competent authority here in the UK or in the UK, and the comply with UK REACH IT system is the IT system whereby you submit your dossiers and notifications, etc. So now let's go into the crux of this webinar. So looking at the public consultation. So already back in December 2021, if you remember from past webinars, we discussed this, but Defra already mentioned that they are committed to exploring alternative arrangements for UK REACH transitional registrations in order to support chemical businesses whilst upholding the highest standards to safeguard public health and the environment. And as part of this work, together with the different agencies in the UK and trade associations and other industry representatives, they were investigating this potential to reduce the data requirements in the dossier and thus reduce the burden on the registrants in the form of lesser costs, because data costs, as we all know, it's one of the biggest cost drivers when it comes to registering for EU REACH, for UK REACH or Turkey or whatever. So that's why if you want to make things cheaper, you reduce data requirements. But since then, very little detail was available. That's some 30 months ago already, but now, thanks to the public consultation that was launched not quite 2 weeks ago, 1.5 weeks ago, Defra has provided additional information on this alternative transitional registration model. It also included other proposals for improving the UK REACH regime, but basically I've categorized these in different parts in this presentation. I call them part 1, 2, and 3. These are different from the parts in the consultation, if you look, so don't be confused. These parts are only for this webinar, so just so you know. So the first part is proposals on the registration related requirements as part of this ATRm model, talking about hazard requirements, use and exposure information, and chemical safety report and related information requirements. Then the second part is the proposal on the substance group data sharing and joint data submission. And then a third part where they're looking into the administrative part, so looking at transitional evaluations, or people touch upon that briefly, compliance checks, publication and data, etc. So we will actually not cover part 3, but focus on part 1 and part 2. Part 1 is of course the most interesting here today. Before going into the depths, anyone can respond to this consultation. You will find the link here. I think just Google consultation on UK REACH. I think you will land on this page. I suggest you respond to this if you have a vested interest in this. If you are a transitional registrant or other stakeholder, it is quite an undertaking to start answering all the questions, I can tell you that. So it's not a small feat, and we have not done that yet, so I do not know, is it possible to save your answers and come back later on? I hope so, because otherwise it'll be quite the effort. So it actually, the consultation encompasses several documents in PDF format, some 93 pages in total. Of course, there's a bit of overlap, and there are different English and Welsh versions, but these Welsh versions are not included in this 93 pages. So actually, it's about 100 pages of supporting documentation. So quite a lot of information, albeit having read through it, a lot of details are missing. So devil's in the detail, and the devil seems to be missing. Anyway, once the consultation is done, meaning in in July 11th was the end of the consultation date. Then the government, so the UK government, will collect all the responses and provide a response within 12 weeks of the end of the consultation. So by October, they will probably typically go to very close to the deadline, so to speak, of this 12 weeks before they then come up with a response. Then there will be a second consultation focused on the applicable legislation and how that's going to be updated. I do not know if that will contain information about the updated fees to be determined. And then the aim is to have this legislation in place in 2025, so that then you have this ATRm model if the consultation then as a result recommends that, which I think it will, then the legislation would be in place in 25. But knowing from experience is meaning legislation in place in 25, it's code for by end of 25. We'll see. So now we'll go into the details. So looking at the ATRm, so going really into as much details as we can in this webinar from a practical perspective. So first of all, so what is the ATRm? So it is the Alternative Transitional Registration Model, as discussed already, announced earlier in last year, and the purpose is to significantly reduce the estimated 2 billion British pounds cost to the industry. And this cost was based on this impact assessment from last year, was related essentially to access to data. So buying hazard data from EU REACH registrants and consortia. So in response to these concerns of these things costing, of course, the registration deadlines were postponed, as we discussed, and now they have developed this alternative transitional registration model as published in this consultation. So this ATRm, really the aim of it and the crux of it is really that it reduces the costs for businesses by removing the need to purchase this very expensive data from EU data holders. So these can be typically consortia or lead registrants in some cases, when they are transitioning from EU REACH to UK REACH. So that transition is still going on because we haven't passed the registration deadlines yet. And then they say, of course, to satisfy all the NGOs that all this whilst maintaining existing human health and environmental protections. So if you want to have more details into these, what I'm referring, please have a look at these study impact assessment from last year and the policy paper. This new impact assessment now as part of the consultations, don't get those confused, and that's actually here in this next slide. So keeping in mind this about roughly 2 billion cost for the industry, so based on this new impact assessment as part of the consultation document, they are now estimating that the cost will be reduced thanks to the ATRm model by around 70%. So this reduction includes the reduction in the data requirements and the increase in provision of use and exposure information, which we'll talk about in a few slides. So based on this impact assessment, they are now estimating that the total cost for UK REACH for the industry will reside around 660 million pounds. So quite a significant reduction, and that's quite obvious because usually the expensive parts of registering is the data access, and because that is costs, and we will see in a few slides. So now we go into details. We'll look in the next subsections. We'll look at the hazard requirements for registration. This is, I think, probably the most interesting. Then use and exposure information. This is very complicated, and we will not be able to go into details, but I'll try to give you an overview of that. Chemical safety reports, issues, fairly easy, and then also joint submission, data sharing, and substance groups, fairly easy to understand. Okay, looking at hazard requirements for registration. So essentially what information you need to provide as part of your registration when you submit your dossier. And this is done in practice by including such information in the lead dossier, and then you as part of the joint submission are referring to that information in the lead dossier. So just to elaborate a bit on that. So as said, we discussed this. Current registration model is just too expensive. With this ATRm, the rationale is that they want to significantly reduce the cost for industry. And as far as the model goes, they have also succeeded with that. So here we can see in a nutshell, albeit a very busy nutshell, is what the information that is supposedly needed to, or not supposedly, but will need to be provided as part of the registration dossiers if this ATRm model goes through, which I believe it will. So for all substances at 1 ton or more annually, you need to provide classification information on the substance. So only classification and labeling related, so GBC, according to GBC CLP information for registering the substance in 1 to 10 tons. Quite a significant reduction in hazard data requirements. For over 10 tons, these are for substances that then also require a CSR, but not exposure scenarios. You need to provide a PBT assessment, so the conclusions thereof, DNL, so the derived non-effect level information, PNEX pertaining to environmental information, so predicted no effect concentration information, and also this information as part of this substances, this first category. So these are additive. So each of these require also all the information as part of the previous step. And I have a nice summary on this in a couple of slides, so don't worry about it. And then you have substances that are classified according to, so essentially classified, and more specifically according to Article 14.4. We'll look at that in brief. Essentially, it just means all substances that are classified over 10 tons annually will also need to provide select physical, chemical, and fate hazard data. So physical, chemical information on the substance. We'll come back to that. So they're also saying that you do not have to provide study summaries or robust study summaries automatically. And also additional testing proposals, new testing proposals would not need to be submitted to the HSE as part of registration. So quite significant reduction. And now for those of you who are wondering what was the Article 14.4, I have one slide here, just summarizing it. Essentially means all of these hazard classes except the ones that are under red. So technically speaking, if your substance is classified, then it triggers this last requirement. So I will not go into details. You can pause the video in YouTube and take a screenshot if you like. I just wanted to have it here for completeness purposes. So gases under pressure, self-heating substances, mixtures, corrosive to metals is excluded, but all other hazard classes, if you have those, then you are in the highest tier for provision of information if you are above 10 tons. And you also have to provide the CSR and exposure scenarios. Those are not going anywhere, but we'll come back to that. So here's a summary table. I try to make the one that was provided as part of the consultation a bit clearer. So what this says is that, as said, if you have 1 to 10 ton substances, and if it's you need to provide classification. If it's not classified, you need to provide. You do not, of course, have to provide a classification, but you need to have the information to be in order to determine whether it's classified or not. So in a sense, you need to provide classification information, but any other information you do not have to provide. Then if you are at 10 tons, above 10 tons, so the CSR requirement kicks in, it's not classified, then you still have to, of course, provide hazard classification information. So here it should say yes and no, sorry. It's yes and no, consider that. I'll update it in the slide deck, albeit that will not benefit you, but just keep that in mind. So here you need to provide, as we looked at, so the PBT assessment, VPVB assessment, PNEC or similar information or conclusions, DNLs for workers, general population. And if you are classified according to this 14.4 article and you're above 10 tons, so you need to submit the CSR, but also the exposure scenarios. Then on top of all of this, you have to also provide the physical state and these other endpoints and fate property related information. But if you have dealt with EU REACH registrations in the past, you can already tell that the level of endpoint data is really essentially non-existent, because all of these other ones data here are derived, including the classification. The only endpoint data is really here. So that is quite interesting. And then for intermediates, only classification and labeling related information, whether it's classified or not, this should be yes and no also, as mentioned. So so these revised hazard requirements will apply to all registrations of substances that were on the market before 21. So meaning these existing substances, sometimes called transitional substances. So under these transitional provisions, doing grandfathering and NRES. And what is interesting is that if for whatever reason you are registering a transitional substance, an existing substance, but the EU tonnage band, say, let's say it's 10 to 100, but in the UK you want to register it as 100 to 1,000, then it actually triggers you to provide a full data set for the substance. So that's quite interesting and of course makes sense. And then for new substances, obviously you still have to provide the full data set according to the original text. But on top of that, you also have to provide use and exposure requirements. We'll look at that in the next slides. So quite significant changes to the hazard data requirements general for these different types of substances, existing substances, that is. And also a bit entrenching on the new substance domain, meaning use and exposure information also needs to be provided, as we will look at next. And we will not go into details here because this is very complicated and we will not have time to go into all the nitty-gritties here. And even the consultation is quite, if you ask me, quite lackluster, for lack of a better word, on this remark, on this section on use and exposure information. Anyway, the rationale for needing to provide more use and exposure information pertaining to human health and environment is that industry and regulators need to have this good use and exposure information to understand how to manage risks and of course ensure safe use of the substance as such or is in a mixture. Also, these use and exposure information is also used as input in many of the regulatory activities by the authorities, for example, into the restriction process or prioritization of substances for inclusion into the authorization list and so forth. So this is all information that is very relevant for safe use of the substances, for both from a human health and environment perspective. And also, as part of a separate analysis by the HSC and Environment Agency in the UK on existing EU REACH registration, they indicated that this existing use and exposure information in EU REACH registrations is quite often incomplete and, as they say, not fit for purpose. So apparently meaning not accurate enough to make good enough like recommendations for safe use of chemicals, for example, or adequate determinations to include it into the restriction process, authorization list, etc. So their aim is to improve on this part by building on the existing use and exposure requirements. So they are keeping what is in the legislation, but adding more to it. So additional levels of information, we'll look at that. So they will need, registrants would need to provide enhanced use and exposure information at 3 different levels pertaining to human health as part of this ATRm model. And this will also apply to new substances. We looked in the previous slide, so that's good to understand. So it's new substances do not get out of use and exposure information free pass, but they also need to provide it. So here we have the infringement into the new substance domain, so to speak. But that makes sense. You want to cover all of the substances now and in the future. So they will collect use and exposure information pertaining to human health and the environment. And this depends on the hazard profile of the substance, but also the tonnage band of the substance. And they're proposing 3 different levels for human health related use and exposure data. But they're only proposing one level for environmental use and exposure data. Well, for some strange reason, they call it level 2. Maybe it's similar to level 2 for human health type of use and exposure information, which we will look at now in the next slide. So if we look at human health use and exposure information requirements, and I'll go through this quickly. If we have substances between 1 to 10 tons, then the same requirements as are currently in the legal text of the UK REACH and the EU REACH for that matter applies. So you provide the same information. No additional requirements are no. They are not layering additional information requirements for these particular substances. However, if you have a substance that is between 1 to 10 tons that are classified, again, according to this article 14.4 criteria, so generally classified, but are also or are substances that are over 10 tons, then you need to provide, in addition to level 1 information, you need to provide level 2 information, which then has information such as percentage of substance in the mixture, physical form of the substance, number of sites, professional uses, number of workers at the industrial sites using the substance, exposure reduction methods, and routes in which exposure could be regarded as negligible, and why, and so forth. But then for level 3 human health data, so the most stringent type of data as part of additional to what is now required according to the legal text, applies to substances between 1 to 10 tons that are classified and meet the toxic criteria as part of this PBT assessment, or is a respiratory or skin sensitizer in all of the categories. So it means that for these, you have to provide level 1 information, level 2 information, and level 3 information. So level 3 information then also constitutes potential levels of exposure and estimations of the totality for consumer users, sorry. As said, we will not go into details what this means in practice. We will maybe have a different webinar really delving into the details, technical details, but for this webinar, this will be the level of information disseminated to you folks. Okay, so that was the human health. Now we have environmental use and exposure related information. So there were no levels. There was just one set of information that is applied to all substances regardless of classification and so forth. And by the way, now you're asking yourself, why do I not have to provide all this level 3 information for over 10 ton substances? And I'll come back to that. You can figure out the response. It's in the consultation, buried somewhere, but you can figure out. Before I get there, I'll just look at the environmental use and exposure information that needs to be provided as part of the ATRm model, registration, some action level and frequency of use and annual use at the individual sites, and cumulatively information on sites related to potential levels of exposures and estimates of the totality of consumer uses. So you can see that these consumer uses are also very prevalent here in these requirements. As said, for some mysterious reason, the consultation calls this level 2, maybe because it's equivalent to human health type of level 2 information, but for in my slides here, I just call it environmental use and exposure information. So what I've done is, again, try to enhance the triggers table that was included in the consultation and make it a bit clearer. So here we have 1 to 10 ton substances. If they are not hazardous, then you only have to provide level 1 information for human health. And yes, you always have to provide environmental related use and exposure information. But if it is a classified substance, then you have to provide level 1 and 2. If it is classified and then meets these toxic criteria, and as we looked at in the previous slide, then also you have to provide level 3 information, so 1, 2, and 3. Again, environmental information is required always. Then for full substances, here is the trick. Why do I only have to provide level 1 and level 2 information and not 3? And the answer is because you are providing level 3 type of information in your chemical safety report. So you are providing that already. Whilst currently, according to current legal text, this information is not provided for 1 to 10 ton substances. So you are providing level 3, it's just in the CSR and CSA, CSR. Intermediate substances, there are nothing for them for use and exposure because they are under strictly controlled conditions assumed. If they are not, then they fall into these categories here above. I just wanted to make that clear also. So this is I would say the use and exposure information part is by far, I would say, the most technically complicated as part of the consultation. The data requirements are fairly easy to understand, but this use and exposure information part really would benefit from more guidance, as all of these sections obviously, but we will see how this will pan out. And to determine really these practical implications, more information will be needed. Anyway, then circling back to chemical safety reports, so we have these 4 categories as part of the ATRm to look at that are defined in the consultation or included in the consultation. So again, rationale and proposed changes to CSRs. Now you can understand that if we are providing less information as part of our dossiers, then of course we cannot have the old information, the full data requirements in the CSR referred to. So there needs to be changes. But what they are not proposing is to remove the whole CSR requirement. They are not proposing to change the tonnage band from over 10 tons annually. There was some discussion about having this requirement go to 1 ton, but they've done that according for these toxic substances, very toxic substances, and these skin sensitizers and so forth, as we looked at in the previous slides. So that is not changing. But as I said, hazard data requirements will reduce, and thus the information included in the CSR will also reduce. And certain information that is referenced in standard CSRs will not be there anymore. So we need to change. So the UK CSR, according to this ATRm model, will then not need to include full details on the hazard assessment because, again, the underlying data is not included in the joint submission unless this information differs from that provided under EU REACH. So again, here it circles back to EU REACH, so you essentially have to have access somehow to the EU REACH CSR so that you can have the same information. If it differs, then you need to potentially provide additional information. We'll come back to that I think in the next slide, if I recall. So I just put it as a permalink to EU CSR here, a question mark. So permalink is just establishing like a reliance on something more or less permanently, and that's essentially what it would do. The CSR, according to ATRm, would only need to report key hazard data and so the classification labeling information in practice, and then of course this PBT BB assessment conclusion. And then these are enough to be able to determine do I have to then prepare the exposure assessment and risk characterizations and communicate this in exposure scenarios to my downstream users? And all of this will then be included in the CSR with the PNEC and DNL values as we discussed earlier, and select physical chemical data if needed. So that was for the higher tonnage band. Let's have a look what that was for. I can't recall. So it was for over 10 tons and classified substances, yes. And again, there's no need to explain in the CSR how the DNLs and PNEC values or the conclusions thereof have been gotten to these. If these are again the same as for EU REACH dossiers. So again, there's a permalink here also. So essentially it's relying heavily on these EU REACH CSRs and contain information, and really you have to make sure that you are using the same information. Of course, using this information is a question which I will raise in a few slides. Is that something that you need to pay for? And then if the DNL PNEC values deviate from the EU REACH values provided, then of course it may be that you need to provide justification for this. And what does this justification mean? Does it mean provision of all the underlying endpoints? If that is the case, that would be essentially circling back to the full data requirements, more or less. So this CSR is quite tricky, I think. We'll discuss this more under the implications, but this is what they are intending to do. I think the page numbering was not correct there, but anyway. Then the final part, looking at the substance group data sharing and joint data submission. And by the way, we have a hard stop in Finland time 2:30, so I know that I will go over 60 minutes as predicted. So the substance group, the long story here is that currently in the legal text of UK REACH, there is no definition of a substance group. Whilst in the EU REACH legal text, there was a definition for substance information exchange for us. They've expired, they're not applicable per se anymore because the registration deadlines have passed for EU REACH. So it also has passed for UK REACH. But these CEFs were there in the beginning to facilitate information sharing and also setting up the joint submission and electing lead registrants and so forth, and sharing costs and etc. At least facilitate the effort to get started. And it has been shown that these activities are still undertaken in the EU, albeit of course by the lead registrant as part of a joint submission, but now they want to include this substance group and this CEF type of a functionality in the legal text because it's completely missing from it currently. For those of you who have inquired according to UK REACH, you will know that you are now member of the substance group for that particular substance. But in the legal text, it's completely and wholly missing. So what that means is that the consultation proposes to organize then the UK REACH registrants into this substance group in a very similar way as to a CEF. So you can say that substance group is the same as a CEF. For EU REACH back in the day. So the whole idea is that to enable data sharing in the joint submission, and then of course collecting all the data that is required, agreeing on the classification and labeling, and of course appointing your lead and so forth. And the substance group will then apply to all of these, all of the substances for UK REACH. So regardless of the route into the registration process, so it's new and existing substances, grandfathering, doing, NRES, etc. So all will be new. But of course, if you are registering a new substance, you will create a substance group which is essentially containing yourself only, until maybe at a later date someone else registers the same substance. But still, the functionality is there. So it's also discussed in the consultation. Then of course you will need to, well, they didn't talk about electing a lead registrant, but it's implied because you need to agree what information is then submitted by the lead registrants on behalf of all the members of the joint submission. There will be opt-outs possible, as with any standard registrations for EU REACH at the moment. They just call it substance groups. So that, other than that, it's all essentially the same. So they propose provisions in the legal text that require all members of substance group of the substance group to make every effort to reach an agreement that includes sharing costs under the ATRm and so forth, and also to share costs fairly transparently and non-discriminatorily, as it's already in the legal text, but now they will tie it into this substance group definition. And also agree on cost sharing models so that also new and existing registrants take benefit of those, and they are also defining what happens if new registrants are joining later on, so reimbursements and so forth. Standard stuff. So this substance group data sharing joint data submission part is fairly clear, I would say. But just a reminder, to access the substance group, you still will need to submit an inquiry, so according to UK REACH Article 26. So this applies to doings, NRESs, and of course new substances. New substances will not benefit from this ATRm model, but they will still have to submit an inquiry to access a substance group. So this inquiry, as far as I can tell, I could not see anywhere in the consultation this inquiry requirement being removed. So you will have to go through it. You have to submit data about your substance composition and analytical information to get that approved. The only ones who do not have to submit an inquiry are the ones who are grandfathered their dossiers into UK REACH, because that you will automatically be made a member of the substance group, because the dossier already includes the inquiry level information about your substance ID and analytical information. So that apparently is not going anywhere. So practical implications of the ATRm. So this is a non-exhaustive view, and on some of the implications of the ATRm, it is also highly my personal view on some of the cases, so please keep that in mind. It may not necessarily reflect the views of REACHLaw in general, or anyone else for that matter, as we are quite early in this process. Anyway, so practical implications of the ATRm. So is data used for ATRm free to use? And I can tell you this will be a very juicy one, because, and unfortunately, I will not have conclusive let's say information on this, whether it can or cannot. It's more of an open question, as we'll see in a few slides. So as we saw in the consultation, the ATRm still requires certain information to be included in the registration dossier, depending on the substance type and the tonnage band. So classification, is it classified, what type of classification it is, and tonnage band, etc. So we are talking about classification labeling information, PBT. This is derived information. What it means is that it's derived from FISC, ChemTox, Ecotox endpoint data. Well, PBT, VP, VB assessment. This is always a tricky one for us Finns. It's also derived. PNEC values also derived. DNL values also derived, as said, from FISC, ChemTox, Ecotox endpoint data. Physical chemical and properties, these are not derived because these are endpoint data. But then we have CSRs for non-classified substances, so non-article 14.4 substances. Well, it's derived or concluded. I just call it derived. And then we have, of course, CSRs for classified substances, where you have also need to have this exposure assessment and risk characterization, defining the exposure scenarios as to be communicated to your users of your substances. This is also, of course, derived or concluded. So all the derived information depends on substance intrinsic properties and has typically been generated for EU REACH registration purposes for by EU REACH consortia lead registrants for quite a lot of money. And these also typically hold the intellectual property rights for this data. So now the question is, and we'll come back to that, can the derived information be used? And in some cases, the endpoint data. And just as an example, just wanted to show, I will not go into details here. You can again pause in YouTube and take a screenshot and go nuts with the details, but just showing here what is generally needed just to determine the DNL or other similar conclusions. So these are the same for on the UK and EU REACH. A lot of studies, in vitro non-testing can be done, repeated dose toxicity studies, reproductive toxicity studies, carcinogenicity studies, all kinds of studies for different DNL types. For PNEX, the same. This is for environment purposes. So predicted no effect concentrations. Studies on animals, in vitro growth, on algae, short-term, long-term, fish, Daphne, QSAR for non-testing methods, read across category justifications, and so forth. So the point of these slides is that just to provide a PNEC value, there's a lot going into those. So it doesn't mean that all of these have to be done, but there's a host of studies and work to derive a PNEC. So just taking a PNEC that someone else derived is the big question here. So just as an example, showing some of the studies for performing long-term studies for getting the DNL and PNEC values and conclusions, you can see that some of these rodents can be very expensive. This doesn't mean that everything has to be done. It is some data can be obtained in different ways, but this just shows that these studies that distill the information so that we can get a DNL and a PNEC value are quite severe. So now in the UK, if we are providing the DNL and PNEC information as part of registration, it will be based on these type of studies in many cases and these type of costs. Let's look at the physical and chemical properties tests. These are much less expensive, but still, if you had this over a 10-ton substance and it was classified, then you had to do additional, provide these specific endpoint data. So these were the only endpoints per se that you need to provide in your dossier. So these are the generic testing costs. If you have to do the full battery, which you would not typically have to do, except maybe in this case of ethanol as an example, but sometimes you could find these values, of course, in literature elsewhere. But let's say if you would have to do everything, then we're still talking about a bit of a costs. Of course, not all are applicable to all cases. So like vapor pressure is not applicable to titanium dioxide, for example. But just to show, having the endpoints having the results of endpoint of studies, so having the endpoint values usually means that there is a cost behind for generating these endpoints. So do I need to pay for example, for the PNEC and DNL values or other data when I'm registering according to the ATRm model? So typically these DNLs and PNEC and classification labeling type of information, it's available in the ESDSs or safety data sheets or extended safety data sheets passed down the supply chain, for example, from EU and EEA suppliers, so registrants. And if you are in Great Britain, then you would receive this safety data sheet, and the question is, what can I do with this information? Well, obviously, you can re-author your safety data sheet and include the same information and pass it down to your customers so that the correct information is propagated down the supply chain to your DUs and they can benefit from that. Same information, by the way, can also be found to a high degree from ECAChem. But the big question is, can this information be used for UK REACH registration purposes according to this alternative transitional registration model? Because that's somehow I get the if you read between the lines, it's somehow evident, maybe, in the consultation, or they don't take stake to it, but it almost implies that you have somehow access to this DNL and PNEC values for easy use in your UK REACH registration. But this may not be the case. So, open questions. Can the information be copied into the UK REACH dossier from EU REACH, from safety data sheets, from ECAChem, other sources? What about the data owners of the underlying studies? So again, not the derived end results, the PNEC and so values, for example, DNL values, but the actual studies that provide the underlying data for deriving these values. Can that be used? How should we consider this when determining costs? So I'm pretty sure, as stated in the slides, I'm pretty sure that the owners of the data having the IPR or the underlying endpoint data used for these derivations of these PNECs and DNLs, for example, pretty sure they would not be very happy if we just take the PNEC and DNL values and use them, for example, PNEC and DNL values and use them for our UK REACH registration purposes without some sort of permission or compensation. So the question is, will then the lead registrant on behalf of the substance group still need to purchase data from EU REACH data holders? And this now is the big question. I do not know. I would be inclined to say that they would need some sort of a permission, but this is for lawyers to determine, and probably a separate subject for a separate webinar where we can go into this in more detail, having discussed from a contractual IPR with some IPR related lawyers and etc. to be seen. And then also about this CSR, as we discussed. What about using the EU CSR as a template for UK REACH CSR purposes, where we take away quite a lot of information, but we still use it as a template because it has to have the same information, because if it deviates, then we have to provide justifications for why it has deviated. Maybe that means we have to actually provide endpoint data. We do not know. So can you use the CSR, for example, without permission? Likely not. Same as for the underlying endpoint data. So there are like a lot of open questions, and I would say the IPR related discussions to the underlying data to be used for ATRm purposes will be really interesting to follow, and as said, probably a subject for a separate webinar. So just quoting Milton Friedman here, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. So I think this is one of his sayings together with some other people. So I think it's somehow fitting to this situation. So, and also very interestingly, for those of you who follow this over the years, there's been a lot of discussion about publicly available free data, but that is completely missing in the new consultation documents. I wonder why. Anyway, also looking at the use and exposure information related implications, these are very complicated. The open questions are how to ensure that all the use and exposure information is actually trickled through the supply chain up to the registrant, and they have a complete picture of this of the supply chain and can include all of this information into the dossier. What if a use is not covered downstream? Will the downstream user still make a DU CSR where applicable, or what are the measures if this use and exposure information is very detailed and it's completely missing for your case? I can just tell you that communicating and collecting this information from the downstream users is very, very, very challenging already as it is now for EU REACH, for example. And for example, when we have worked on upstream authorization applications, we'll not go into details what that is, but essentially there you are collecting very accurate use and exposure information from the supply chain to have them specifically covered in authorization. It has been very challenging, and those supply chains are not, they can be complex, but I can imagine that for generally supply chains for UK, for GB will be probably much more complicated and long, I would say. So it's not clear. Furthermore, it's also not clear how this use and exposure information would be captured in the IUCLID dossier under section 3, especially for these 1 to 10 ton substances that do not require a CSR or this chemical safety assessment, because much of this information is then captured there currently in detail. So there are a lot of open questions. Practical and clear guidance will be crucial really to determine how this will work in practice. Okay, registration observations. I'll just go through these last ones quickly. So to our understanding, these will still be compiled. The ATRm dossiers will still be compiled in IUCLID. The question is, will there be a specific template for ATRm, the model, meaning there are different requirements, less requirements showing what is needed and what is not. If there will not be a template, will there be guidance saying that, okay, just fill in these you can leave blank, but then the problem is the validation assistant will not work. So questions. Also, as mentioned before, we are understanding that the section 1.2 on the composition and analytical information in section 1.4 will still be required, because they're doing you need to submit an inquiry and so forth, and you still need to make sure that you have the same substance, and you can assess its hazards depending on its impurities, etc. For example, in the classification and so forth. So you still need to check substance identity profiles when registering, and you provide analytical information. So you will not apparently get off that hook, so to speak. Also, transitional evaluations. So it's a mechanism for the authorities, so the HSE essentially to ask the registrar to provide full data if they have some concerns that some information is lacking or something. So what does this mean in practice if you are one who are going through these transitional evaluations, and they're asking, hey, you need to provide full data, or you need to provide full data on this substance. Of course, you will not have it. What does it mean? Do you have to go out and purchase the data, and so forth? So suddenly it could become like a lotto. Those who win will have to pay a lot, albeit we are estimating, or this impact assessment is estimating that only 10% or 0.1% or so, 0.01% of cases will go through this transitional evaluation and require additional full data sets. So 1 in 100 registrants will get the bingo. So we'll see how that pans out. It's not a big deal until it happens to your company, I think. Classification labeling, just wanted to note that because they are in provision of hazard data, providing classification and labeling information as, for example, included in the EU in the safety data sheets from for example, EU, or your current safety data sheet that's based on the EU REACH and EU CLP classification. Then, of course, if you are using that same classification, it also means that you are locked into the same type of classification regime. So does this mean that there will probably not be so much deviance between GB CLP and EU CLP in the future? That's a question. Manufacturers and non-EU, non-European Economic Area importers may still have to do, of course, further testing to be able to classify their substances according to GB CLP. Not a big issue, but something to keep in mind maybe. And the final thoughts before going to conclusions, and sorry to say, we'll not have time for many questions. I'll come back to that. So the first registration deadline is coming up in 2026 in October. So that's 2.5 years from now. Now, actually less. So there's quite a lot of things need to happen before that. So the legislation needs to be in place likely second half of next year. So that means that there's only 1 year remaining until the first deadline. As we know, not a lot will happen until the legislation is in place. Then the question is, when will we get guidance documents on actually telling us how to do this in practice? Because now it's fairly abstract still. So we need clear, comprehensive, practical guidance on, and in good time. It's not, I would say it's not enough to have it 1 year before the registration deadline. So in October 2025, next year, I would say we would need it maybe this year already to be able to prepare and discuss, and especially if we need to start negotiating about data access for the underlying studies in some cases, has to be determined. So it is quite a lot of things that need to go and happen in a short order of time so that everything works. So there's not a lot of time regardless of the reduced data requirements as proposed in this ATRm. So for those of you who are Top Gear fans or Grand Tour fans, I think you are fairly know this saying, what could possibly go wrong? For those who get it. The other ones can Google it. Anyway, conclusions, quick conclusions. UK REACH entered into force January 2021. Then we had these transitional registration deadlines proposed last year into law. So that's good. And then we had this consultation launched a couple of weeks ago, where we're covering this alternative transitional registration model, and it runs until 11th of July. So please do provide feedback on these, and preferably also on these data access things, because that will be a big thing. And the aim of the whole ATRm is to reduce the cost to industry by removing the need to purchase expensive data, meaning we don't have to provide these endpoints in the dossiers provided as part of this ATRm. But again, as mentioned, the big question is, can derived information, so for example, DNLs and PNECs, be used in the ATRm registration without having legitimate access to the underlying endpoint data? Or the values themselves may be subject to IPR. These are big questions to be discussed and hopefully resolved in good time before these deadlines, registration deadlines. And also on this use and exposure information, as discussed, how does it work in practice? How do we reliably and thoroughly collect information from the supply chain on the use and exposure to include in this registration dossier? And then foremostly and lastly, of course, industry needs guidance, practical, clear, comprehensive guidance on how to tackle this in practice, and have this guidance available in good time so that we can prepare. So time is short. The first deadline for registration is, according to current legal text, is 26 in October. So clock is ticking. And of course, REACHLaw, we're following all these developments very closely, and will of course keep you up to date on any further and new information coming up. So thankfully we have life in UK REACH. It looked bad there for more than a year, but now we have a pulse. So now we can also start providing additional information and keep you updated on the changes as they are coming in. So I recommend you definitely take part in the consultation, and remember it closes on 11th of July, so it will be open on the 11th of July still. So that will be your last day to submit if you will not do that, if you haven't done so by then. And of course, if you need any support with UK REACH, feel free to send any questions or quotations to, for example, sales@reachlaw.fi. And now we go into the Q&A, and we have exactly around 10 minutes to go. So to have first come, first served answered, I will go through the pre-submitted questions. I see that we have questions in the chat. I can see that there's quite a lot of questions here. I can tell you I will not have time to go through all of these, unfortunately, in this webinar, but I can try promised to come back with you with a Q&A document in the interest of or considering that we have 10 minutes to go. So anyway, let's tackle some of these. I will stop at some point, and those I'm not answering, I will include in the Q&A document. But anyway, some questions submitted. We'll start with those. Anyway, to import a grandfathered substance by a new importer, so no, because grandfathered substances were substances that you had registered for EU REACH that were grandfathered into UK REACH. So if you now a new importer, new legal entity, then I mean, you cannot grandfather. You do not have the substance registered from EU REACH. So the question is, does not apply, I would say. Yeah, the whole thing, grandfathering does not apply to this situation. So you have to go through an NRES likely. You please feel free to contact REACHLaw. That will be happy to help and guide you through the process. Which registration model is better? Well, obviously the ATRm is simpler in the sense that less data is required, but then the use and exposure information is more diligent. So what is better depends on who you ask. So I think from the industry, saving costs, at least in the short run, assuming everything works as smoothly as people want, which is seldom the case, I'd say the ATRm model is better for them. For us, REACHLaw, the work will still be the same. People will need to register, and we will provide such registration services, and that's it. The lead registration work will obviously be less. That's pretty sure. But pretty clear, obviously, with the reduced data requirements. Differences between EU REACH and UK REACH, I will just say that it is deviating more and more, and now this whole ATRm process or this model, of course, makes the deviation even higher. So I think we will have two different beasts the longer we go in the future, and there will be less linkages, except the permalinks that we discussed earlier between the two. Maybe those will be broken at some point also, who knows. But yes, more deviations to be expected, I mean. Does it still make sense to submit NRES in light of announced ATRm? Any significant impact on NRES expected from ATRm? So I think we covered this, but yes, I mean, the NRES is your ticket to immediately place a substance on the GB market. So yes, NRES is absolutely the first part. You should do that as soon as you want to start placing a substance on the substance that is not eligible to existing supply clause on the GB market. You should go through the NRES, the first part of the NRES process, which is the deferred registration, as soon as possible. But in the long run, you will be taking benefit of the ATRm model if it will work as predicted. Understanding how formulations fit. Well, substances as part of mixtures need to be registered and apply all the ATRm models, apply substances and so forth. Of course, you need to classify the mixture, but for ATRMs, we were talking about substances. So I'd like to know how we can change an OR on registrations grandfathering doing. I mean, on this particular, you can change only representatives if your OR has a grandfathered substance that can be also changed as an like a asset transfer, and yeah, doings obviously can be submitted by the new ORs, and they can also be transferred, but in most cases it's easier to submit new doings. But I recommend you contact us directly on this, because I can provide more, let's say, granularity on my replies, because the grandfathering could be tricky, but I think we will be able to solve that also. Current system of email invoices for payment and registration is too slow. Yeah, I'm not expecting any changes to that, so sorry for that. But then again, we're not the HSE. do we have to expect any new requirements for articles in UK REACH? What are they? So we haven't tackled articles at all in this, and I will not. So please, the ATRm model per se does not bring any changes to articles, except if you have a substance that is specifically intended to be released, and then you have to register it. But those are really few cases where we have this. Either it's a substance in a container, and the container is the article, which does not itself release anything, but the substance in the container needs to be registered. But that said, from our ATRm perspective, no significant changes, or no practical changes, let's put it this way. Yeah, and I'll just take a few questions to let my colleague off in just a few minutes. So let's see. I'll take the last one here. I'll get back on these other ones. How will a change of government affect the ATRm? So indeed, there was general election proposed during the weekend for July. It was the 4th of July. And of course, if the government changes, there might be further delays in implementing new legislation and stuff like that. It depends on the new government. So we will follow this and see what happens, and we are all at the whims of the government, so to speak. So we'll see how that goes forward. So with that, apologies again for not being able to go through all of the questions. We'll come back with a Q&A document. So in any case, feel free to reach out to REACHLaw for UK REACH support if you need some help with the consultation or any other topics. Feel free to contact us. We'll be happy to help. And we stand ready, of course, to support you with your UK REACH and GBCLP compliance efforts and more. So with that, thank you very much, kiitos and tack for your attention, and I wish you a very good day, and of course, stay compliant. So thank you. Bye-bye.